This video is brought to you by Ren. There's something about major changes, patches, expansion packs, and new products that are intoxicatingly cathartic for players. Perhaps it is the potential for renewal and rebirth that taps into the mind far more than anything else. A ban list, something so small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things, perhaps is a projection of this profound, innate human desire for progress and development. That is, I believe, why the ban list seems to cause such a visceral reaction in the player base. It draws on this real-world parallel because it signifies growth and development. The Forbidden and Limited list is easily one of the most controversial yet popular topics in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Perhaps it is the biggest subject in the entire game for people who actively play and don't play alike. When looking at the views of ban list predictions, ban list reactions, and custom tournaments, it is easy to get my point when these things obtain hundreds of thousands of views, which is massive in the context of Yu-Gi-Oh! In this video, I would like to take this time and opportunity to talk to you about the ban list historically, more so from a structural and design perspective rather than individual card choices. For many years, the ancient history and past of the ban list has been shrouded in mystery. Archaeologists have fossil dug their way deep into the earth, churning out fumes with their ancient gear golems destroying the world around them. They dig deep into Mother Earth, all in hopes of finding... And you're bad, bro! And so for this video, that's why we've teamed up with Ren to create a cleaner world for us to... Ren is a website where you can calculate your carbon footprint and make charitable donations towards ecological causes. The process is made easy enough that mind players can do it, with short, easy-to-follow questionnaires on the website that allow you to find out where your carbon footprint is biggest. Usually the damage is right here. With donations towards charitable causes from a diverse mix of climate solutions, you can help with carbon removal, reforestation, and climate policy. If you do decide to donate, you can get monthly updates to see what projects the money's been put towards, with photos of every tree planted, every acre reforested, and every ton of carbon offset. As I live in Scotland, I personally felt closely attached to the project Mineral Weathering, which by adding crushed basalt to the forest land, it directly helps sequester carbon for millions of years to come by storing it in rocks. The solidest of rocks. Yeah, maybe it'll come back eventually. Join the cause. The first 100 people who sign up using the link in the description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. It's kind of funny to me, and I suppose shows my age, but as time goes on, newer players actually don't know just how many alterations the ban list has gone through. And I'm not talking about cards, I mean its implementation and design. There once was a time, for example, where the ban list only came twice per year and was also unified alongside the OCG as one format. Yes, even though OCG had products 6 months in advance before us. It wasn't completely uncommon for cards to be printed and released in the TCG for the first time ever as limited, or even in some cases banned. Because of there being a unified list between both regions, an infamous example of this odd interaction is September 2010. In this update, Temple of the Kings was banned, a continuous spell which used to allow you, pre-errata, to activate all of your traps from your hand on turn 1 without setting and waiting. This made sense for the time, as cards such as Reckless Greed, Jar of Greed, and Exchange of the Spirit could allow for some really degenerate Exodia or deck out FTKs. Extraordinarily for TCG players, Konami had just banned a card that did not exist. And even more comically so, the card would still, despite its ban, be printed in the upcoming October 15 product of Structure Deck Marek. Another strange instance of this clashing of regions was further exacerbated by the fact that sometimes North America and Europe would have different card pools. Some boomers until today, because of the PTSD that Gore's Emissary of Darkness caused, will still attack with their lowest monster first in fear of having a token dropped on them. Gore's was limited to 1 copy on the September 1st, 2008 ban list. 2 months later, North America would receive Gore's into legal tournament play, but at the 1 copy it was limited at because it was too powerful of a card in the OCG months prior. But even more bizarrely was that because this was an American exclusive product debuting at Walmart, yes, you heard that right, Europeans wouldn't be able to obtain this card until almost an entire year later in July 2009 with Retro Pack 2. Now, what do we need a ban list for? Why does it exist? For many of you, these questions are not something that are really officially answered. We can probably interpret to some extent that it exists to balance the game. Now, this might be news to a lot of people, but there was once a time when Konami had more direct communication with the player base. Over 10 years ago, Kevin Tuert, head of US development for the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, explained in a series of blog posts why the ban list exists. To prevent a situation where you feel locked in, where you have to play with certain cards or a certain deck, to keep it so that there are choices for what deck you play and avoid having one dominant deck. To restrict solitaire play decks, these are usually first turn combo decks where one duelist plays by themselves for 15 minutes, shuffling and summoning while their opponent twiddles their thumbs. And finally, to eliminate cards that are confusing, cause games to stall, create infinite loops, or otherwise interfere with tournaments and make them unpleasant. I wasn't around at the time personally, but to say that this blog post is groundbreaking or even monumental would be an understatement. Perhaps in the day and age of 2012, the interconnectedness we take for granted today probably doesn't fully picture just how important this is. I would highly recommend that after this video you take a look at this article and have a read for yourself. While it is 10 years old, it does bring up some very interesting and thoughtful, eloquent points. Now obviously, while we can't take what Tuert said 10 years ago at face value because it's been 10 years and of course design direction and philosophies change over time, but it is still an interesting read to look at some of the problems that they identified back then and how they parallel with today. Tuners that can be used for any synchro monster, are easily fetched from the deck, are reusable with no cost, and can grab powerful synchro monsters that have no specific requirements. This turned out to not be okay. I wanted to highlight this because 10 years later, in the context of the Halka-Fibrax's recent ban, it's quite funny to see how things perhaps haven't changed so much in 10 years. This is really the closest thing we can get to the logic of the ban list for today's standards. It is there to create card and deck diversity, to restrict solitaire decks, and to remove cards which cause ruling and tournament nightmares. 10 years on, whether this goal and everything that they've said in this article ring true today is a topic for a different discussion. For now, even today, all of the logic and reasoning put forward by Tuert I think rings pretty true and for the most part makes a lot of sense, at least in theory. The problem, however, was that it appeared for many players at the time, while Konami was saying one thing, they were kind of doing another. They talked of powerful synchro interactions that Bulb and Spore offered in this article, but those cards were starting to be phased out because the format was moving away from plants and into the notorious Inzektor wind-up Dino format. They mentioned solitaire decks and the concept of nipping it in the bud, and yet wind-up Hunter and Zen Mighty would go on to run rampant thereafter, even in OCG, which we could see coming a mile off. Now, when you consider that the OCG get entire live stream events, a blog post would probably be a little crude and dated for the social media standards of 2022. But even something like a small blog post is still a form of communication that would be extremely well appreciated and received with felicitations by the player base. Now, moving on from why the ban list exists in the first place, we can probably head back to the origins of the game. The beginning of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a very confusing time for multiple reasons. In terms of the ban list, there are lists beginning in the OCG starting from 1999, which can then be translated over to the TCG later in 2001, despite the fact that the West is behind on many product releases. Documentation during this period is fairly weak and sparse, but for the purposes of this video, the most important thing for you to understand is that the game is played at a staggered pace between OCG and TCG, with incremental and small updates to the TCG starting in May 2002. This would be the first ever ban list that saw the Exodia pieces and some power spells limited. From this date onwards, nothing special particularly happens. A couple of updates occur throughout 2003, but there is an important noticeable change that happens and develops a pattern for the future. The most important being is that there appears to be the beginning of a schedule. From 2003 onwards, every major ban list would tend to be dropping in March and September for years to come. 2004 onwards was kind of business as usual with this schedule, and it saw the first banning of the cards ever, and this sort of trend would continue up until 2006. In 2006, something unprecedented happens in Yu-Gi-Oh! And we see the first ever emergency ban. Cyberstein, better yet known as Stein OTK, was banned on December 1st, 2005 in the TCG region only. It wasn't until March 2007, almost 2 years later, that Cyberstein was banned in the OCG. This was odd for the time because for years now the OCG and TCG lists were mostly the same, but here began a pattern of variations between the two regions, despite officially they were to be unified. In 2008, more TCG-only variations occurred, with Allure of Darkness being semi-limited, Return from the Different Dimension being limited, and Dimension Fusion being limited. It's important to note as well that this didn't occur during the standard March-September cycle. If you go on the Yugioh-card.com website, these hits are not listed there, despite them occurring in 2008. That's because the website itself tends to only track OCG formats historically up until 2013. This ties in with the Time Wizard format that has been recently developed. The interesting thing, however, is that remember when I said that March-September would be intervals which Konami would upload ban lists? As it turns out, this TCG exclusive hit occurred in May. In 2009, Konami takes control over the Yu-Gi-Oh card game from Upper Deck, which is an entire drama in and of itself. I would recommend the Mega Capital G video if you're wondering what happened in detail, but in terms of the ban list, there is actually surprisingly no major changes to the structure and its implementation from this point onwards until 2013, where the infamous September 2013 bloodbath occurs. This is when the official split happens. No longer would TCG have cards be released banned or limited based on what's going on in OCG, and no longer would there be a strange balancing of two separate card pools via one single list. It never made sense and it really was kind of impossible to achieve, and so from this point onwards the ban list starting from September 2013 would be separate, but more importantly would actually occur more frequently. It's from this point onwards that until today we've been receiving a ban list update at roughly 3-4 month intervals. With so many product releases, side sets and reprint sets, as well as of course the main core sets, and the general power spike that Yu-Gi-Oh saw in 2013, it makes sense in terms of today because of just how much product there is available and the development and speed of the formats. A faster ban list cycle is a good way to sort of keep the game in check more often. In April 2015, Konami stops giving an estimated end date for the ban list. In July 2015, Kevin Tuert returns to communicate with the players their intentions with the change to the schedule of the ban list. Remember that this is coming up to 2 years later since they changed the schedule from 6 months and joint with OCG to independent and at 3-month intervals. A disappointing delay to say the least. Players were still happy to hear from Tuert's insights once again like they had before. In the blog post, Tuert highlights the significance of the 3-month interval change, noting that it gives Konami flexibility when addressing changes. The most important factor in this change, he states, was because that they felt locked into changing lists at specific dates when perhaps they felt that actually not much needed to be addressed. It's been 7 years since this blog post. Sadly, this would be the final time that Konami themselves would ever communicate their reasoning and intentions surrounding the ban list, at least in terms of its implementation. But also this would be the last time that players would officially and directly hear from Kevin Tuert himself. We're going to update the list very soon, but we're going to update the list when it's ready, when the time is right, and when we have the feedback and data we need to make the best decisions we can. January 2016 was the release of one of the most powerful decks ever made, Performapal and Performages, conventionally known as MM in OCG, with its inception to Pepe now in the TCG. This deck was very quickly so dominant and powerful it was performing even better than Dragon Rulers and Teledad did. And so 13 days later, in February 2016, Konami made one of the most bizarre announcements ever for the TCG. An emergency ban list, something we had already seen with Stein OTK back in 2008, this was actually bizarre for other reasons. Konami drops the first ever, and unsurprisingly, the last ever, adjusted list. We don't want to perform a knee-jerk reaction on the Forbidden Unlimited card list because that list isn't just for high-end tournament play, but also for when duelists play at their friend's house, at school, or wherever dueling might take them. The logic used here was that the adjusted list might be seen as too soon and too heavy of a hit to a brand new deck released only less than 2 weeks ago. So for those of you that want to play with this list, you can, or you can choose to ignore it. This particular adjusted list will take effect beginning February 8, 2016 and applies to all tournaments held at YCS's, regional qualifier events, and UDS qualifier and invitational events. Well then at this point what's left? That's right, OTS's or local game stores had the option to opt out and choose not to follow this list. And this is why it's so bizarre and strange, because if anything, it's the local stores and the smaller casual tournament settings that would need an adjusted list, rather than having the option to ignore it. Why wouldn't an environment of casual players want to take a strong and firm stance against a tier 0 deck? Again, perhaps the strangest decision Konami has ever made with regards to the ban list. If this is the first time you're hearing about this, there's a good reason for that, because they never actually did it again, unsurprisingly. Until this day, and I played very actively at the time personally, I can't think or have ever heard of any store choosing to ignore this list, because again, why would they when their stores tend to be filled with more casual players? It should be noted as well that the author of this article is written as Konami Digital Entertainment and not as Kevin Tuert. We don't exactly know who wrote this or who came up with the adjusted list suggestion, but it was a really sad time, because since we no longer have a personal and human face to connect with in, for example, Tuert anymore. And so this would be the end of our journey, for it is indeed the final time Konami makes communication with players surrounding the ban list ever again. 6 years of radio silence and nothing has been heard since. Later that year in August 2016, Konami drops a final blog post surrounding the ban list, and in this, the logic and reasoning behind these hits and the metagame are given as they've done before. But Farfa, you just said that the adjusted list was the final time that Konami ever made communication with the player base. That is technically correct, because in this blog post, which is no longer available and has since been deleted by Konami, or at least I am unable to track it down on an official website, I think it is accessible via web cache, the editor comments regardless. Please note that the opinions expressed in this article are those of our writer and may not necessarily reflect those of Konami Digital Entertainment BV. This article should not be viewed as Konami's justification of recent changes, but rather as a writer's thoughts on how the changes will affect the top decks in the future. In the grand scheme of understanding and communicating with the players, this article kind of really served no purpose. It's intelligently laid out and explained, it's a decent read, but technically this article is no different to browsing Twitter or watching a Team Samurai YouTube video. They unequivocally state that this does not reflect Konami Digital Entertainment's perspectives and intentions with the ban list. It is not representative of KDE. Fast forward until today, and so much time has passed from this point that players have created a release schedule spreadsheet. In this spreadsheet, it highlights the no sooner than date, the time and day before or after no sooner than the list is revealed, and then the effective from date. In the spreadsheet, we can gather patterns of roughly when the ban list drops, which is generally 5 PM UK or noon EST, and general seasonal gaps between each list. We can create an average time between no sooner than and effective from dates, cross this with a standard deviation, potential upcoming major event clashes, and voila! You have almost an algorithmic prediction of when the next list will be. Desperate, I know, but you have to ask yourself, what else is there to go by? I think it was some point, perhaps in 2020 or 21, Konami begins posting the new list immediately on Twitter and even Instagram, rather than people relying on running browser extensions that ping Konami's website every 5 seconds for a response and a potential web page update with, for example, Chrome extension like Page Monitor. But in January 2022, Konami makes the biggest change to the ban list structure in years by this point. They remove the no sooner than clause, meaning that we don't know if the ban list still follows 3-4 month cycles, and we don't know which premiere events that are upcoming definitely will not utilize a new or current ban list. No sooner has now simply been reworded to a few months from now. This is as accurate as an indication that Konami is willing to give. What does a few months from now mean? 2 months, 4 months, or 6 months, we don't know. What is clear, I suppose, is that since now that we've had 2 lists under the few months from now era, we can kind of gather that ban lists are still sort of in the same 4-month average cycle timeframe. Practically, nothing has really changed, I guess, except for the removal of the exact date. And that is kind of really where the story ends for the ban list. Konami preferred to just simply not talk about it. It may be that they're jaded from the 2018 ban list, where players would continuously post under every social media post begging and demanding the removal of Firewall Dragon from the format, or even more recently, the removal of Mystic Mine. But jaded from Backlash dating all the way back to 2012 with the notorious plant hits and Inzektor windup format shouldn't really come as an excuse. I think that if there was a major problem to highlight with the game today, I feel personally it would probably be something like communication. I don't think it's unreasonable for players to expect some form of communication or indication of potentially when the next lists will occur. While the OCG receives fun events and live stream reveals for their lists, TCG have an Excel spreadsheet maintained by some British guy which notes website patterns over the course of 5 years. It's hilarious, but also kind of sad at the same time. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment down below with the most interesting or fascinating fact that you discovered during this, or potentially add any new information I may or may not have missed out. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, then the best way to support me is to subscribe and like and potentially share with your friends if you haven't already. Please follow my other forms of social media, primarily my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/Farfa, where you can watch me stream daily from 2 PM UK onwards. Thank you everyone for watching, and until next time, adios. And give it a read for yourself, because it